Okay, so let's try and develop a little bit of intuition for what radian measure means. Okay, so we saw in the last video that 180 degrees was equal to pi radians. Okay, so we can use that to try and figure out what things like maybe 90 degrees would be, or 270 degrees. Okay. Here's a circle, and this circle is centered at the origin, and I'm going to look at several different places around the circle here. So we know that right here, this is the same as saying we're at 0 degrees, and we know that 0 degrees had better be 0 radians, because that would just be weird if it wasn't, right? Okay, and then we also know that 180 degrees, so if our angle, remember we measure going counterclockwise starting at the positive x-axis. So if our angle goes all the way around over to here, this is 180 degrees. And we know that 180 degrees is the same thing as pi radians, okay? So let's see, how about 90 degrees? So 90 degrees, we would start here, go up to here, this would be 90 degrees. 90 degrees, well, that's half of 180 degrees, so it kind of makes sense that maybe that would be half of pi. Now, the way we usually would write that is pi over 2 radians, and I just want to say that as an aside here, so when I write pi over 2, that's the same thing as saying 1/2 times pi, because think how fractions work. If I have 1/2 times pi, that's the same thing as saying 1/2 times pi over 1, because you can put anything over 1, still the same thing. And then when you multiply fractions, you multiply the numerators. 1 times pi is pi, and you multiply denominators. 2 times 1 is 2, and so you see that that's the same thing as pi over 2. It's just a different way of writing it if I write 1/2 times pi or pi over 2. Now, you're going to write it like this when you talk about radians, but it means the same thing as 1/2 times pi. Okay, so that was 90 degrees. What about 45 degrees? Okay, so now 45 degrees is about here, and so if 90 degrees was half of pi, 45 degrees looks like it should be 1/4 of pi, and it is. So this is pi over 4 radians. All right, well, what if I had 3 pi over 4 radians? What would be the corresponding number of degrees? Okay, well, that's 3/4 of pi. So pi is 180. 3/4 of pi would be 3/4 of the way to 180, which would be about here. And that ends up being 135 degrees. So if you think about 90 and then adding 45 more degrees, that's 135. Or you can think of going all the way to 180 and then going back 45 degrees. Either way works. They both tell you that this should be 135 degrees. And let's try one more. How about pi over 3 radians? How many degrees would that correspond to? Okay, that's 1/3 of pi. Well, if pi is 180 degrees, then 1/3 of pi, well, 1/3 of 180 is 60, which is about there. That makes sense if you think about that's 1/3 and then another third, be that angle, and then the last third to get to 180. So this ends up being 60 degrees. So this is just to develop some intuition on how to go between radians and degrees. In the next video, I'll show you a more precise, a more formal way of converting between radians and degrees.